Today, we're going to talk about this great new book. I know most of you are on listening on the recording side rather than the live Zoom, but this is the Shabbat guidebook for parents. Halacha of caring for infants, toddlers, and children on Shabbat and Yom Tov. And we're excited to jump into that. I want to encourage people to pick up this great new exciting book. And let me tell you a little bit about our speaker today. The author, Rabbanit Alissa Thomas-Newborn, BCC, is the Rabbanit at Congregation Netivot Shalom in Teaneck, New Jersey. Netivot Shalom is a modern Orthodox shul, which she leads together in partnership with Rabbi Nati Helfgot. Rabbanit Alissa is a Board Certified Chaplain and full-time staff chaplain at NewYork-Presbyterian, Columbia University, Irving Medical Center, where she has specialties in palliative care, critical care, and emergency psychiatric care. And she's the president of NAJC, Neshama, Association of Jewish Chaplains. Rabbanit Alissa is also the Moishe House Based-In Teaneck clergy and an Atra fellow in the inaugural Northern New Jersey Rabbinic Redesign Fellowship. From 2014 to 2022, Rabbanit Alissa served as spiritual leader at B'nai David-Judea Congregation as the first Orthodox female clergy in LA. A frequent writer and speaker, she received her ordination from Yeshivat Maharat and graduated from Brandeis University. Rabbanit Alissa and her husband Akiva live in Teaneck with their children Ella and Liam. Thank you so much for being here, and we're excited to learn with you today.
Thank you so much, Shmuley. I'm so excited and grateful to be here and to be a part of Valley Beit Midrash. I love the video that this started out with, that there's many different ways to engage in Torah, and that it's, in the mind and the action, in the spirit. So I just appreciate the chevra to have this conversation with. So thank you for having me. I'm very grateful to have just published this book, as Shmuley just said. It's the Shabbat guidebook for parents. And I'll just say, I want to share with you a little bit about how it came to be, some of the personal reasons that I wrote it and why it's written the way that it's written, but also to frame it within, some Torah texts. And especially since Pesach is coming, I am going to touch a little bit on some of the halachic parts in the book that are about Pesach, because I figured, why not? If you're listening to this, maybe it's Pesach, maybe it's not anymore, but just to be able to get a little taste of the kind of content that's inside of the book. So it started out that I was working at B'nai David-Judea with Rabbi Yosef Kanefsky in Los Angeles, as Shmuley said. And I was getting shilas. I was getting these questions from members of the community about how to take care of kids on Shabbos and Yom Tov, on Shabbat and the holidays. And then those parents told their family members across the country to reach out to me as well. So I started to get these, people that I didn't even know reaching out, saying, we heard that you answer questions about Shabbat and parenting, and especially I think like the combination of the halachic with the pastoral was something that people were really interested in. And it occurred to me that there's a real need for this. But the truth is that this really started with my own need, which was I had my daughter, Ella, who's now 5.5. And as much as I knew the halacha and had been keeping Shabbos and, did not need to look to a guidebook, hypothetically, I really did need a guidebook, because I suddenly found myself asking myself questions and others questions about how to take care of my child on the holiest days of the year. And it's things that maybe you wouldn't think of. You would think maybe are not, are pretty self-explanatory, but it may sound obvious. It actually takes intentional thought. So, for example, a family may know that adults generally don't bathe on Shabbos, but what about newborns and messy toddlers, or when there's like one of those terrible poop explosion diapers that happens? You might also know not to grind your own food, and that's not so common anyway. But what about when we're feeding little kids, and that certain things need to be ground down, or a certain kind of texture? diaper changing. There's a lot of different opinions about wipes. We know that we don't squeeze cloths or sponges because of schita, which is the squeezing on Shabbat. But what about wipes? Do they count? Are they wet enough to fall into that category? And the truth is, there's a slew of questions like this that come up, and they really result in three different ways that I think most of us respond to them. So the first is that, honestly, I said this was like a real talk book talk. This is just, let's just lay it out there. Sometimes we just ignore it. There are many of us who would just ignore the question and do what's going to be convenient because, of course, we have to take care of our child. We're tired. We're dealing with whatever we're dealing with. Then there's the parents who can feel despondent and afraid to ask, because I've been keeping Shabbos my whole life. Why should I have to ask questions now? Or if they're new to keeping Shabbos, maybe they also still feel like this is something I should know. So they err on the side of stringency, which can sometimes actually lead to strict practices that can be unnecessary, discouraging, and even dangerous. So the first, response is like, I'm just going to ignore this. The second is to be like overly machmir, overly stringent. And then the third is where, there's parents who will go through that, like I was mentioning at the beginning, that live question and answer process with whoever their clergy is that they turn to for those kinds of questions, which is great. It just also means that the parents in the middle of a very hectic and stressful, intense time in life will now be learning Hilchot Shabbos, will be learning the laws of Shabbat, and have to be committed to going through that. So I looked around as a new parent, and I wanted to just find like a safe area that I could get some clear answers on, and I realized that there's like some really amazing, thorough Sfarim that are out there. But there wasn't really something that was accessible for me as a parent who needed to just do things quickly and easily and smoothly, and in a way that was relatable. And I found I was, listening to podcasts and reading books that were so accessible. Like there's a potty training book in 3 days where it's short, it's sweet. There's sleep training books like that, short and sweet. You know that you're going to get what you need, and you're going to be able to go on to live your life in a positive way. And that's, there's time for having real lamdus and deep learning. And certainly, if you can learn the Mari Makomo, you can learn the text in their original source. That's fantastic. But I think for most sleep-deprived parents at that stage, just wanting to be able to feel supported, not just in sleep training, not just in potty training, but in their Judaism, I realized for myself and also for others was something that was missing. So it's important. I just want to mention that there is a book that's called Care of Children on Shabbos and Yom Tov that was originally published in the 1950s. It's the closest thing that I saw to this, but it was out of print. And the rabbi who wrote it, Rabbi Wagstall, his text was reprinted in the 1970s and in the 1990s. But when I ordered his book, and I did find it extremely helpful, especially in terms of, turning to him for some footnotes and other things. But it was written in a way that didn't speak to me as a 21st century mom. And what I mean by that is, talking to a family about how to keep Shabbat when there's two working parents, or where both parents want to be at shul on Shabbat, or where there's, just certain modern sensibilities. It was not written with that tone, which is fine. Sfarim don't always have to be written exactly how we want to hear them. And it really is a fantastic book. But I got to this one point in it where he was talking about like spilling on ourselves if we spill or stain our clothing on Shabbos or Yom Tov, which, of course is a malacha. It's one of the, we're not going to be, removing the stain or the dye that has happened. And yet, the question was like what we do in that moment, like if there's spit up or if food spills. And so, he was writing that the best practice is for women to wear aprons, because in that case, there wouldn't be that need to get that stain off. And that's really when it hit me. I was like, you know what? I feel like I went like out of my way to find this book, and I'm so grateful that it existed. There has to be someone else who needed this kind of support, and maybe who would not feel connected to wearing an apron as a solution. So that was, one of the sort of like aha moments for me personally. Um, so I'll just sort of give you a little bit of the structure. But first, I want to say I like a piece of Torah I think that's kind of grounded me, is that the malachot, the 39 malachot, are written in a way where there's we have avot, we have the father ones, fathers, or we can say parents, and then you have toldo, you have the children ones, and just the fact that this is how the halacha speaks about how we keep Shabbat, and really like outlining our most sacred time and space is articulated in a parent-child relationship. That I think is really what all of this endeavor is about for me. My hope is really that parents, grandparents, anyone who wants to, who's a caregiver, can look it up, look quickly for a question, move happily on. You can also read it from the beginning to the end, and there's pastoral guidance in there as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. But in general, I think that the intersection of how we take care of our families and how we serve God, that those pieces, how we find divinity and meaning and purpose in the world, Shabbat and Yom Tov are really like the laboratories for us to bring that ethic to life. And there's a lot of ups and downs that come with that journey. I found it very relatable to read some secular books that were speaking about, some of the stuff that goes wrong, or some of the doubts that we have about ourselves. And I felt like, that voice exists in our tradition in terms of, we're always learning, we have humility, and how can I, use my voice in some way to try to share that experience. So I'm going to share really quickly, just share my screen for a moment for those who are here. This is the table of contents. As Rev Shmuley showed, he has a book. I also have the book with me. But the structure that I chose to follow was the timeline of Shabbat. So there's, a letter from me in Hakarat Tov giving thanks to the people who helped make this possible, like the publisher Irving and many others. And then some helpful halachic practices for parents. So just like some really quick snippets, or what are some of the principles that are going to come up. And then to do the flow of Shabbat. So, Shabbat evening, the experience of having Shabbat dinner together, what happens feeding an infant or a toddler, sterilizing the bottles, especially because, I have some friends where they've said like, now that I have my third child, I don't sterilize anymore. But for some people, sterilizing is very important. And then, how do we wash? What's the issue with kashrut? And then Shabbat bedtime, diaper changes, as I mentioned before. There's wipes and creams, lotions, powders, how those things are how they play out. Potty training I mentioned too. And then, we're, as 21st century Jews, we're using white noise machines and baby monitors. There's, sometimes assistive medical technology that our children need. And then, some people also ask questions about tracking apps, humidifiers. There's technology that comes in that just, again, thinking about, a book speaking to the current reality. I think it just felt like a meaningful thing to address. Each chapter begins and ends with a kavanah, an intention, which, if you are familiar with me in any way, I love kavanot. I think that, starting and having some sort of an intention can sort of like sum up or help us really be like fully present. And then there's Shabbat day, similar, the process of how you would get up in your day, like getting dressed and getting the kids ready and all the things that go into that, all the carrying. If you're someone who does go to shul with your children, what is the halacha around that when you're praying? What is there's the davening for someone who's holding a baby that has a poop diaper or something along those lines. Bona, which is building. So, strollers, high chairs, all those things. We know that we can use them, but what's the thinking behind it? And what are the things that we can't use that maybe we're unaware of? Toys, spills, stains, and messes. And I think probably one of the most important parts is when a child gets sick or hurt, which unfortunately does happen, but when we're a parent taking care of a sick child, and we're holding this additional voice in our minds of, can we do this? But we're thinking about our child and we have to do everything for our child. There's sort of an inherent stress that I think a lot of people feel. And so, that chapter addresses it in a lot of different ways. And then nannies, babysitters, etc. The last two parts, there's Yom Tov additions, which are things that are different from Shabbat. And then the very last section is what I had mentioned earlier, which are pastoral resources. So taking care of the parents as part of taking care of the child. There's, marital stress and harmony. And when we have children, our whole lives change, including our marriages or our relationships. And if someone's not married, where are they getting their support? And NIDA, I included some very, very basics. None of this is meant to be comprehensive or exhaustive, certainly. But I've gotten so many shilohs over the years from women who've asked about, now that they have had 4 children, they forgot how to keep NIDA and they need a refresher. So just to be able to have that easily accessible with mikvah and other things, body image as well. How we deal with our bodies changing completely from childbirth. And then there's a lot of, mental health stuff that comes up for us too with postpartum depression and anxiety. And again, just putting this all within a Jewish context for us to think about how the holidays can help us better connect to each other and to Hashem. And then finally, the last part is this journey of building the family, the secondary infertility, pregnancy, infant loss, chas v'shalom, but having that be a part also of even just naming that as a part of the parenting guidebook, I think is important and at least meaningful for me. Finding spirituality in parenting, and then it ends with rituals, creative rituals to incorporate in your home. So I'll stop sharing the screen, but that's just the basic table of contents. And I chose to share that with you because I think it gives you a little taste of the combination of the halachic with the pastoral, which is really, again, I think what's driving me. So I just want to pause for a second because I talked a lot and find out if there's any questions or anything specific that is on anyone's mind who's here in the room. No pressure. I am going to, at some point, shift to talk a little bit about Pesach, but I just want to pause now.
I'm just so excited to read the book. I'm just so excited. That sounds like everything that I need. So I'm just, oh my goodness, so excited. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much, Nata. Thank you for saying that. I'm really glad to hear it. And I would love to talk to you about it as well as you're reading it. Hear your journey and your thoughts and feedback. I'll just share that when I was first, again, I have 2 children. My daughter is 5.5. My son is 4.5 months old. And that gap between having our first child and our second child included a very long fertility journey. We unfortunately had multiple miscarriages and ended up needing to do IVF, and that was a different process. So certainly anyone, I say at the end of the book, anyone who, wants to email me and be in touch, I'm very happy to talk, make me feel, it's not a burden. I would love for you to reach out to me. Please do. But that experience of really trying to build our family and the suffering and pain that went into it was exhausting. And I think also is a part of a bigger fabric of my own awareness or appreciation of parenting. So when again, my daughter Ella is just, I love her so much, and she's a wild girl, and I've learned a lot from her. But I remember when she was a toddler, we were talking about I think she just needed it to be perfect. Whatever it was, it needed to be exactly her way. And of course, I'm hearing myself, right? That's my own inclination of wanting to have control or having perfectionism, and I'm seeing it in my child. I'm sure you've had this experience too, if you're a parent, where you are witnessing, your best and worst qualities come out in your children, and then you have this unbelievable opportunity to support them in that, which is also simultaneously supporting ourselves in that process. And I read again, like a non-Jewish book that said, we get the children that we're supposed to get in this world because they need us and we need them. And that's like in our own spiritual refinement. And I think for some people that really resonates. I understand for other people that may not resonate as much. But for me, I certainly felt like, as someone who, with my daughter, I had postpartum depression and anxiety, and I was just, everything had changed, and I was trying to make sense of myself and my own relationship to, similar to, to Judaism and to halachic practice. I wanted to do it as someone who's maybe perfectionist and likes to have control in certain ways, just to be honest. I wanted to do it like right, like read the books and make sure I was doing it well. And I didn't feel like I was. And so I just remember having this conversation with my daughter where she was so focused on things being perfect, and how that was something that I could either respond to in a parenting way in the moment of trying to get her to be flexible or whatever might be. But I chose to also respond to it as a spiritual challenge for myself. And, and how amazing that she's my child and I'm her mother, and I get to actually support her in this, and I understand how she feels. So I think, a lot of my goal with this book is to have that, to build that dynamic and relationship with our children, where the holiday is infusing us and them with spiritual support, where we are lifting each other up in, like Malin Bikdusha, where we're going up in holiness together. And I don't mean that in like a, sort of esoteric, non-relatable way. I mean, like, very practically, like, how can our keeping Shabbat help us feel more spiritually connected? Because I've heard so many times, I think of one woman in particular who told me several years back that Shabbos was the least meaningful day of her week. That she used to be someone who learned Torah all the time and went to Shiurim and, did like 2 years in Israel, and she just loved learning, but that when she had kids, there wasn't enough time. And I think that so many of us have that experience where we might lose a part of ourselves, or that part may specifically be our spiritual connection. And it's not meant to be like we take a break and then we go back in once our children get a little bit older. I think actually the halacha is there, as I mentioned, with, the avot and the toldot, the parents and the children, for us to access these texts that help us grow too spiritually. So someone wrote in the chat that it's never too young to teach Shabbat habits. Well known that habits then become behaviors, and in Judaism, that is good. Amen. So I definitely, in terms of things like dressing nicely for Shabbos, beginning to, even though there's chinuch, kids are really learning how to keep Shabbat from a young age, having the ethic that we, there are things that we want to do but can't always do. Or, we're dealing with that certainly with technology. But I think just being able to appreciate, I get myself dressed nicely for Shabbat because I'm honoring it's lichvod Shabbat. It's to honor Shabbat. What does that mean from, my own relationship with body image and other things that I'm bringing about, like respect for myself or respect for others or respect for God in a physical manifestation. So there's different ways that I try to touch on how those halachot can not just be practical, but also really something that, as you're saying, like habits becoming good behaviors, that's, if you know that, you're not turning off the light, or you're brushing your teeth in a certain way, or you're, refraining from doing certain things, it also builds character. And I think definitely, certain habits along the lines of being fully present, like that's even like a mindfulness piece. I know I hear people say this all the time with technology. If they didn't have Shabbos, like they'd never turn off. And so being able to have these days in Judaism, Shabbat, Yom Tov, where we get to just be with each other, and that can be our immediate family, our children, grandchildren, could also be with community members. Some of us may not have children ourselves, and maybe, we relate to this in terms of other people's children, or in terms of people that we teach who are also in our tradition an extension of ourselves as students and as children. But yeah, I totally agree. I think having those habits and inculcating them from a young age is really, really, really important, and also important for us as the teachers to be teaching that as well. I think, again, many years ago, a father said to me that his experience was that Shabbat was the most stressful day of the week. So you think, Shabbat Vayinafash, it's supposed to be this time where we can relax and be present and be spiritually inspired. But is that how you feel about Shabbat? I would, encourage anyone listening to ask themselves, what is their, relationship with Shabbat coming? Often there's stress leading into Shabbat because we're trying to rush to get food made or rush to get home from work or, get all of the things in order. But ideally, when we light candles, when we go to shul, we have that opportunity to exhale and to have that relief. But when someone else needs to be taken care of, and that could be a child, it could also be, a parent, anyone who's a caregiver, when someone else needs to be taken care of, that opportunity to breathe can often be skipped over. And it's certainly, I think within the context of self-care, do we make time for ourselves to feel seen and cared for? But then there's some stigma around that too, right? Like, well, yeah, I need self-care as a parent, but also, I have to take care of my children, and that would be really selfish for me to put my, my own needs over someone else, which I think a lot of people naturally feel. So, again, I think that God, Hashem, gives us this structure where it's not just within a family unit, it's within our entire culture that, we have this chance to connect more deeply with each other. And there are so many things that will need to be done no matter what. And even the malachot can't stop us from, waking up in the middle of the night to respond to a child's needs or whatever that is, because, it's not against Shabbos, God forbid. But I do think, there is an opportunity for just figuring out how we can take better care of each other. So, this father had said to me, it was just the most stressful time of the week, and was genuinely, exploring, like, what could they do? Could they have childcare on Shabbat for half the day so that, he and his wife could go on a walk or take a break, take a nap? They didn't have family locally. If you think, like, historically, if we are living in a shtetl, and some people still do, I live in Teaneck, and I know that that's still, quite possible. But if parents and grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles are within walking distance, it's a different environment than if, someone has moved for a job and they don't have any family locally. The shul usually becomes more of like an extended family. But also, when do you get those breaks? And how do you make, again, Shabbat that day of rest for you as a parent? And I often think of it as, and I say this in the book, when new couples get married. So I'm a kala teacher. I'll teach new brides and couples. There's a whole part of our tradition where we put time into learning how to be married. And that's because there's all of these new halachot that we're going to take on. There's new practices that we're going to have. Our relationship with Hashem and halacha and community is fundamentally changing. And it's not just because there's new things being taken on, it's because ourselves are now connected to another. So my experience of a certain mitzvah is now somehow connected to a person that's not just me. And so it makes sense that would be something we have to do some learning around, or that we have to put extra intention, kavana, into. And I would argue so too for when, people are either becoming parents or have, multiple children at any stage. Just being able to have that intentionality and support, where am I going to get, especially let's say if I don't live near family, how am I going to feel like I'm supported? How, what do I want my Shabbat table to look like? I remember being it was probably in college, like going to different people's homes and seeing how they did Shabbat outside of my own family, and thinking like, oh, do I want to do that? Like, do I want to have that kind of challah board? All those things. But I would push that. I think that that's also, a greater spiritual ethic. Like, what do we want our, again, as was said in the chat, what do we want our children to be learning in terms of habits, in terms of values? So I'll pause again just to find out if there's any questions at this point or any comments.
Rabbanit Alissa, this is Alan Malkin, Phoenix. I put something in the chat about how the connection between habit, rituals, and behaviors, how there's this beautiful connection. As a medical person, I know this all too well in mental health and physical health and wise aging, healthy aging, that if you can take a habit and then turn it into behavior and incorporate it into your daily routine, what a great piece of learning this is. And in Judaism, this example that you're giving about Shabbat is a wonderful example, but it would apply going to shul. It would apply davening daily. It would apply putting on a tallis or laying tefillin, and try it as a habit, and then advance it into a behavior, into something that is a daily thing that you do. And I think more enlightenment is needed about this, about how you can take the habit and turn it into a beautiful daily behavior that benefits us. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you for framing it that way. I think, Yasher Koach, that was beautifully said, and I love what you put in the chat. And I think that I'm reminded of a teaching of the Eish Kodash, the Warsaw Ghetto Rebbe, who spoke about how, a person who can hear Torah in like the sounds of the birds, hearing, Judaism and halacha and Torah in hypothetically the mundane, but also in the routine, that person has an awareness of God that's at an extremely high level. And I think, I know it sounds crazy on one hand, like having that kind of spiritual awareness while we're changing a diaper might seem far-fetched, but I do think that it's inculcating a sense of gratitude, and as you're saying, a way of building a habit and a muscle for us as adults, and also modeling that for children too, to build that in them too. So I'm very grateful that you highlighted that piece. So another question is, how can we encourage children to carry on Shabbat traditions they learned at a young age as they grow older? That's a great question. How I feel like how I read it out loud was almost like how they can physically carry, like, which is some of the halacha. But you're saying specifically, to keep going in their Shabbat observance. So I think, I'll just share anecdotally that, both in my personal life and in my professional life, I've come across many Jews who grew up keeping things one way, and then have kind of let certain things go, or found that maybe that was their family was doing it, but it's not something they want to do anymore. I think, I also have worked with a lot of B'nai Mitzvah kids over the years, and had the privilege of knowing certain kids in a shul setting where they were 5 when I met them, and then I was there for their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. Some kids who I helped with B'nai Mitzvah, and now they're in college or graduated, and so I've also had the chance to witness that kind of growth. And I think the truth is that we have really hard stuff in our tradition, and we have to be able to find ourselves in it. So it doesn't work for most people. I don't want to make a completely blatant statement, but for most people, I've found that it doesn't work to do something because someone else does it, or because someone else told you to do it. We have to have, just getting back to what Dr. Molk was saying, we have to have our own personal relationship with our observance. So how do we encourage children to keep the traditions that they learned as a kid? I think is to have that education and honesty about, the raw and the real parts of our tradition, not just have it be like rainbows and sunshine, but be able to, say like, this is hard. How are you dealing with this? I totally get, and just to use Shabbat as an example, I understand why you would want to watch TV on Shabbat. Shabbat is a time where we can relax, and like that's part of how you relax and decompress. I get that, I do, I feel that too. How do we make sense of that? Or I feel disconnected in this way on Shabbat from the rest of the world. How do we deal with that issue? So I would almost say, they shouldn't be learning about Shabbat traditions at a young age, and then that's it. We should be constantly reassessing how we do what we do in an honest and real way, because I think children respond the best to being honest. But really, how I sort of have thought about it over the years is just, like Alissa Judaism, like myself, how do I see myself in my tradition? It doesn't mean creating something new, but rather like I need to find my voice in the tradition and trusting that our voices are there, and that we want to be in dialogue with the tradition and all the voices that are reaching out to us through the text, people and Hashem's voice, are, it's how it stays alive and grows with us as we grow. So there's another question here of, some treat children halachically as cholim. They have the mental health status of sick and thus at risk. What do you think about this? Kids are physically vulnerable, but how do we think about their minds and hearts and mental health? One book I read recently said they are bechazkat chole, that they're considered to be sick. So let me just clarify, are you talking about only in mental health, or just in general, are children considered chole she'ein bo sakana or chole sheyesh bo sakana?
Yeah, really the mental health aspect.
Okay. Yeah. So, certainly in this book, that's something that I said explicitly about the chole she'ein bo sakana, that children are already in a category where there's leniency when they're under the age of 9 or 10 years old. But certainly whenever there's a medical condition, there's also additional leniencies. I think if we're talking about a child who has, whether they're younger than 9 or 10 or older than 9 or 10, if they're having serious mental health concerns, that's a medical issue that should be taken seriously. So, I know since the pandemic, for example, lots of rabbis have said, for people who are really struggling with depression and who are feeling very isolated and alone, could they use their phone? Could they use the internet or something like that? I think, it depends on the case that someone, whatever the situation is, but mental health is, at least from where I'm coming from as a chaplain, it's also physical health. We don't want someone's mental health to be at risk. I'd be curious, Dr. Molka, you mentioned mental health earlier too. I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
I'm totally convinced that kids are way more perceptive than we realize. They see and notice things that we think they don't see and notice. And I think if children see that we actually extract joy from certain rituals on Shabbat, whether it be lighting the candles, whether it be making kiddush, whatever, that is way more likely to penetrate and to want them to participate and want them to be that way as they grow up. Would you agree with that?
Yes, definitely. If you see someone doing something authentic that you look up to, then it's more likely for that to impact. Absolutely. And to get to, I think, what Rav Shmuley is raising too, and Rav Shmuley, tell me if this is addressing. I'm thinking especially with Pesach coming, for example. We know that we should not own chametz. We're not supposed to benefit from chametz, but that also includes like feeding our animals. We'll have deal feeding our children. Like our children are not supposed to be eating chametz either, even if they're under the age of b'nai mitzvah. So there's all of these rules about how, what do we do with formula? Baruch Hashem, thank God, we have these kosher lists from OU, et cetera, where they outline which formulas are fine, and usually most of them are. But having kids who need to have kitniot on Pesach, have kitniot, like that's a physical need that there's a carve out for. If a child has to have chametz because their doctor says medically they have to, and it truly is a medical need for whatever reason, that's something that's taken into account halachically. But what about someone who is struggling, God forbid, with anorexia. And the act of limiting food, even more than kashrut, because kashrut itself is very triggering, but limiting food intake with Pesach is going to be triggering. I've encountered this with a lot of patients in the hospital, whether it's, adults who have been from their whole lives and dealing with this as a constant struggle every year, or children who are encountering it for the first time. I think that the mental health need is just as important as the physical health need. And anorexia is an interesting example because it speaks to, the physical as well. But I part of what I'm hearing you say is like, we need to prioritize that. So am I getting what you were asking right? So I do at different points in the book say that if there's, it's almost like the kind of thing that you don't think needs to be said, but again, because when you're a parent, when we're parents, we're like all in it. Sometimes when we're emotional because we're seeing our kids upset, we're sick, we're struggling, it's hard to see a bigger picture there. So I think I've certainly gotten questions over the years where people ask, my child is experiencing this medically. Is it going to be okay for them to do that? And the answer is, of course. Let's say it's like a diabetes medication or something that they need. And so I think, for mental health reasons, it goes back to what Dr. Mook was saying, that there's this authenticity that we have to be coming from. So, we're not creating carve-outs for people to use electricity on Shabbat because they want to, and it's inconvenient not to. Instead, it's really creating, I think, like a safe space that we want to make sure that, the parents are taken care of, the children are taken care of. That means with mind, body, and soul. And I would just emphasize, I think that, the psychiatric needs to be taken just as seriously as the physical medical. Psychiatric is still medical.
Well, I was really struck when I read that it was really dealing primarily with teens, that teens are b'chezkat chole, that we got to a point where we think of young people in our society as so unstable that anything could trigger something very dangerous for them. And that kind of struck me as just a sociological phenomenon that is kind of alarming. How suicidal people are and how many mental health risks we have, given that we're glued to screens and social media and the opioid crisis and body image. There's just so many factors that are leading teenagers to be unhealthy. And I remember there being risks when I was a teenager, but I don't remember feeling, maybe I was naive, like we were all just in high risk in a way that a lot of the literature deals with teens today. And I know teens are a whole different subject, really, but just thinking about like the fragility of kids. And we normally think of the positive, developing the mind, developing the heart and the soul, like but there's all this defense also from problems. I mean, when I had foster kids, I felt that. When I had foster kids, I felt like, whoa, these kids are like a moment away from survival. They're like so volatile. But with my own biological kids, that hasn't been my experience at all. For different reasons. But I don't know. So I'm just thinking about how our religious discourse is responding to that sociological phenomenon of fragility of young people. And I just have more questions than answers. So
no, I mean, I think the question's better than the answer. Of pointing it out to begin with. And I saw, Dr. Mulk, you were nodding. Did you want to add something? I think that I was surprised years ago. When I was training to be a chaplain, I was working at a children's hospital in New York, and I've worked at psychiatric hospitals too. I have a particular investment in behavioral health, and I was seeing in the emergency room in the children's hospital young children coming in with suicidality, like 7-year-olds, things I would never think I was like, okay, so maybe 17-year-old, but a 7-year-old. But as you mentioned, it is true, and that's changed societally. So, I think even anxiety, yeah, the way that children are internalizing and experiencing anxiety and wondering about, children naturally wonder about death. But it can be really hard when your child asks a question about death, and as a parent, you're not prepared to answer that question. Or, like a question that maybe is pointing to, like, I wish I wasn't me, or, I wish that, like why is it that Hashem created me, or why do I have to put up with this? And sometimes those comments are cries for help. And sometimes those comments are like children just want to be seen and acknowledged. So I think, no person wants to be treated like they're going to break at any moment. I think like that's, part of, like, we don't want our kids to feel like we're walking on eggshells around them because they're so mentally fragile. Like that can also be really harmful, because what we're really communicating is like, they don't have resilience, and we don't believe that they do. And at the same time, if they actually need support, we can't miss those cries for help that can come in different ways. So it's almost like we're, in some ways being asked to do something impossible, but, we have to do no matter what, which is be sensitive to those vulnerabilities and fragilities without projecting them, or like from the outset, on each other. So I'll just to share personally. At one point, my daughter was dealing with something herself, and I noticed that, like, there a lot of the parenting nowadays is very gentle. Like, you're angry, and I can hear that you're angry, and you can tell that I've like read books and listened to podcasts. And how are we going to work through those emotions? Everyone gets angry. What do we do with that? And I think that one of the things that I saw in my daughter was that she there was a point where she just needed me to say, X, Y, and Z. She just needed me to fall on one side of it, as opposed to trying to like hold her delicately in every space. So I'm not, speaking so specifically, but what I'm really trying to convey is that I think that it is important to be gentle in our parenting, but not so much that we inadvertently communicate to a child that we don't believe that they're strong and that they can get through certain things, and that we are with them in getting through that.
I'd be curious to see a study amongst American Jews of the incidence of depression, serious mental illness, SMI, suicide ideation in let's just say young children and teenagers of families who have a Jewish connection, whether that be belonging to a shul, where the family identifies strongly with Judaism and has have some form of Jewish rituals in their lives, versus American Jews who are disconnected, who are, Jewish in name only, who barely even observe Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, or Pesach, whatever. What the incidence of mental illness, depression, and suicide ideation is in A versus B. I think that would be a fascinating study.
That would be very interesting too, and also thinking about the religious context in which they're living, because some are more supportive of getting mental health support, and some are not as supportive. I'll share that, as a chaplain, I work in a multi-faith environment, so with people of all different faiths and backgrounds, ethnicities and races, and the way that we define spirituality in a healthcare setting is really about, like, where do you get meaning? Where do you get connection? Where do you get a sense of purpose? And that could be from, for someone, it could be from nature. For someone else, it could be, cooking or caring for someone else. But part of also what happens when, God forbid, we're facing serious illness and in a hospitalized position, whether it's, again, physical or a mental health case, is there's a loss of self. There's, a loss of even the day-to-day of how I do things normally. And I'm in a room that's wearing clothes that are not my clothes. It's not, this isn't me. And so I think that, the experience for all of us to have both a sense of meaning and purpose and also a sense of connectedness. It doesn't even matter what faith we are or how observant we are. My book is certainly coming from an Orthodox perspective because that's the context in which I'm writing and living. But I'm also, when I'm a chaplain, I'm serving people of all, stripes of Judaism and also, of any faith or non-faith. And what I feel like I've had the privilege of seeing, what people have let me into, is that when we don't feel connected and when we don't feel there's meaning, that's really when we're at the greatest risk. But if, once we can identify those things that give us meaning and purpose, we begin to have hope, and everyone needs something to look forward to. We all need that. When we begin to lose that, and that's not something that we can't get back, right? Like, we can do that work. But when we don't feel that we have something we're connected to, something bigger than ourselves, purpose, just like a general sense of meaning, that's really when we can begin to feel like, what's the point? So I would certainly hope within a halachic community or in a community that's not observing halacha, that sensitivity and authenticity to children is being communicated. Because I think kids ask really great questions and at every age, and they know when you're not answering authentically. And that's really hard because sometimes our authentic answer is like, well, is this appropriate? Like, do I want to plant that seed? And yet, modeling for children how to deal with the gray will then give them the resilience to deal with the gray themselves.
Rabbanit, I'm sure this applies to all of us. I have several Jewish family members and friends who describe themselves as either agnostic or complete non-believers. What's the word for that again?
Atheist?
Atheists, right. And I see a common thread in each and every one of them, and that is cynical. Which to me is different to being skeptical. Skeptical means to me, you ask questions, is that really? Cynical to me has a direct connection with negativity, loss of hope, loss of purpose, and, what's it all about? What is the meaning of life? And I feel pity for people with that, because that cynicism is to me, it's sad. Just a passing thought. And when I have discussions with them about, I know people who are observant, who are frummers, who believe, and invariably most of them are happier than you. They seem to be happier, even though you're going to use the Karl Marx argument of, religion is opium for the masses. I believe that was Karl Marx. And we have that ongoing fun discussion. But, being cynical part has a very sad component to it. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you two answers. The first is, when I, again, working in a New York hospital, I visited a patient who had been intubated, which, means that they weren't able to speak, but they may have either been conscious or not conscious. Alert is possible that they're aware of what's going on, but not able to communicate. And so he was extubated, the tube was removed, and he was able to breathe again on his own. And he came to our office because he wanted to thank a chaplain that he didn't know her name. He just knew that there was someone who came and sat with him and spoke a little bit, but helped him feel less alone. And this man said, "I'm an atheist. I don't want a chaplain. I don't care about that at all." Like that's not, he's like, I'm the last person that would have asked for a chaplain. But he said, "I want you to know that that is what I needed. I needed someone to just be with me, to have that connectedness. It helped me feel less alone. It helped me feel seen." So it's more like a sort of like a basic humanity. And I again, I would emphasize like where we get our sense of meaning and connectedness is a sense of spirituality. And, that might be in the halachic practice of keeping Shabbat, that we're trying to transmit to our children. It might be something else, but I agree that we need that. And, whether we're using labels like, I know that there's people who keep halacha, but don't believe in God. And I'm someone who deeply believes in God. So I understand what you're saying. But I think, wherever we fall on that spectrum, we can still each answer the question of where we get meaning and connection from. And the other way I want to answer it is that, again, bringing back the mental health piece, I remember sitting and leading a group it was a psychiatric unit, an emergency setting. And, one person was sharing how grateful they were for, their source of support. And the other person next to them was like, I don't have any family, and I just want to appreciate how nice it is that you feel supported by your family. And it was this human connection of people who would never have otherwise connected. But there was an appreciation of like, I'm so happy that I'm feeling supported right now. And someone else saying like, I'm so happy that you have that, and I'm yearning for that. So I think, no matter where we're coming from, having that shared humanity goes a really, really long way. And again, within the context of Shabbat and holidays, it's making sure that we don't have to stop finding meaning and purpose just because we're caring for someone else. And also making sure that, we're teaching our next generation how to do that too. So thank you for this conversation. Thank you for, I sprinkled in a little Pesach. If you have questions about Pesach, feel free to reach out or check out the book. And I thank you for everyone who's been here and sharing your voices and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Rabbanit Alissa. Very, very interesting, especially as a mom of 3 kids. I could relate a lot to what you were saying. Everyone, please look for her book on Amazon, Shabbat Guidebook for Parents. Thank you all for being here with us today. Wishing everyone a happy Passover coming up. Chag Sameach.